So the next unit we're going to talk about is nationalism, and this is when nations are formed. Nations seem to be much more of a modern history type of thing. In the past, long before the modern era, we had empires, we had kings and kingdoms, and people were just kind of conquered into those. But this idea of creating a nation and having set borders and certain forms of government and those kinds of things really is much more of a modern construct. So we're going to talk about that. So first, let's look at what really is a nation. And when we talk about a nation, this is what really is happening here. Think of it as a large group or collective of people. But instead of being conquered in, they tend to group themselves around common characteristics, right? And so think of language. If everybody speaks the same language, back during the Roman Empire, they had conquered so many different groups and peoples that there were many different languages spoken there. And so even though Latin was kind of the language of the Romans in the Roman Empire, when you got out into areas where the Germanic tribes were, or even where England was, Middle East, there were a variety of different languages spoken, and people had a harder time communicating. And so they weren't grouped based on language. They didn't share the same kinds of traditions. There were a variety of different cultures that made things up. Today, if you look in the United States, we have a number of traditions that we celebrate, such as the 4th of July and Thanksgiving and some of these other kinds of holidays that aren't religious holidays, but we celebrate them nonetheless, and they seem very American in that sense. People will group around customs, habits, similar ethnic groups. They identify with those different ethnicities a little bit better, and so they tend to want to form a nation around that. And so nations today tend to be formed around those general ideas. And that's more, when people have the choice to do it, they typically want to form nations with people that are similar to them. Before that, they just kind of got conquered and it was what it was. But when we look at a nation, we're looking at some things that kind of need to be there to kind of help define what a nation is. Number one, they have to have specific borders. And so everybody knows whose territory is whose territory. Where your territory ends, the next territory begins, and that kind of a thing. So you got to have specific borders so everybody's aware of what land or territory you control. You get to choose and set up your own form of government. And that government is autonomous, or your country is autonomous in the sense that you guys get to make decisions for yourself. There isn't some overarching country somewhere else or nation somewhere else that's forcing you to make certain decisions and things like that. If you're in that position, then you really aren't your own nation. You're just more of a satellite of them. So we just got finished with imperialism, and how does imperialism connect to nationalism? And so one of the ways in which nations in the modern era were formed were based on the old colonial borders that were set up. And a perfect example of that is the scramble for Africa. So if you look at this map here, this is obviously representing where the old colonies were when the Europeans came down and they conquered certain territories and took over those areas in Africa. And so the important point about this is not to see exactly where the British were or something like that, but where the lines really are kind of drawn and what these old colonial borders looked like. Because when we look at a map of Africa today and where all of these independent nations are and what their borders really look like, you'll notice that they're very, very similar in shape and size to the old colonial borders and territories. And so what happens and how nationalism gets connected to imperialism is that when a colony finally breaks away from the host country, they end up forming their own nation, and that nation's territory ends up looking very, very similar to what the old colonial borders were. And so it's just kind of a natural flow into that, and that's how they connect. So a lot of times nations are formed when old colonies break away and become independent, and they end up forming their own nations. So when you create a nation, there are lots of different reasons nations form, and we'll get into that more as we work through the unit. But like I said, imperialism is one of those ways. and they're creating colonies with distinct borders, and then finally, once they become independent, those colonies end up becoming their own nations. But there are some benefits and drawbacks to that. Some of the benefits of keeping and maintaining those old colonial borders is, number one, everybody in the world kind of knows where those borders are, and they're established, and you don't have to try to conquer an area next to you and get a little more land, or you lose a little bit more land if somebody comes in and takes away your land. They're already established, so it's nice, kind of already a set up piece of political geology there for you, to where everybody already understands what territory you control. The other thing is, a lot of these colonies, when the host nation came in, is they built a lot of infrastructure. They built roads, they built telephone lines, they put in electrical grids, they did all of those kinds of things, and all of that infrastructure is still in place when they finally become independent. And so if you just continue to be a nation on your own, you get to control all of that infrastructure, so it's nice to be able to do. And then the other thing is, you're already recognized by other nations around the planet as this is your land and your territory. So it's kind of nice to already just kind of have that pre-established for you, and that you just kind of maintain that same identity. But there are a number of problems that come with this too. And I have here listed as one of the problems is conflict among the people. So think about it this way: when the Europeans traveled down into Africa to take over and grab land for themselves for resources, what they were concerned about was the resources or the amount of land that they were controlling. What they didn't care about was the different tribes that now were within those colonies. And the Europeans had the technology and weaponry to be able to keep those tribes under control. But one of the things that they also were keeping those tribes from doing was fighting with one another. And some of these tribes have been fighting with each other for thousands of years. And now all of a sudden, under the rule of, let's say, the Germans, they were now forced to live together and be part of the same nation. And those people never would have chosen to be in a nation with each other, except for the Europeans just decided this is what was going to happen. So now that they become independent, and you maintain those same borders and become a similar nation, now those tribes sometimes go back to fighting with one another. Or they don't want to be part of that same nation, and now you've got a problem because they are, and they have to work together. So they fight over who has access to those resources, what type of government they want to put into power, and if they have a democracy, people get elected in. Well, maybe one tribe ends up with more people elected into the government, which means they control the government, which means they control the resources, and maybe they oppress the minority tribe and the minority group. And so then those people feel oppressed and they want to fight back against that. And then if they eventually win more control of the government, then they start oppressing the other group. And so sometimes you have some real conflict and problems because of how these old colonial lines were drawn, because the empires who colonized these places did not care about the 1,000-year-old struggles amongst the people. They cared about simply the resources. And so when you force them back together at the end, sometimes some real problems can occur. So this next slide here kind of shows you, we just took one area, the Congo in Africa, and you can see some of the different problems you might have. So here is kind of a map of where the different tribes really are in Congo, and you can see we've got kind of 4 major tribes here, and so these tribes have always been battling with each other for resources and access to resources and survival and those kinds of things. And now they're all forced to live together and work together, and sometimes that's not easy to do. Sometimes we have problems around religion, and you can see here in Congo how many different religions there are, and we know some of these religions don't get along very well and have very different beliefs. And you can imagine that might pose some problems if in one nation you've got a variety of different religions that have always struggled. They may struggle again. Ethno-linguistic composition, meaning different languages spoken and different ethnicities. You can see there's a variety in here. These are all the old tribes, and that may pose a problem. So if you can imagine, this can really pose problems now that nations have formed around the old colonial border. So there can be some real issues there, but imperialism and those colonies eventually breaking free and forming nations of their own, or one way is that nations do get formed.